Hey friends, tonight we are going back, way back, to a version of Earth that would make your morning commute feel like a spa day. We're talking about a world roughly 2 million years ago, sitting at the hinge between what scientists call the Pliocene and the Pleistocene, a time when the planet was dramatically, almost personally, hostile to anything walking around on two legs. And yes, that includes your ancestors. Especially your ancestors, actually. The world of 2 million years ago was not waiting around to be explored. It was waiting around to eat whatever wandered too close to the tall grass, the riverbank, or honestly, anywhere that wasn't actively on fire. Your modern brain, accustomed to the greatest predator in your neighborhood being a slightly aggressive raccoon, would have found this particular era deeply uncomfortable. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, drop a comment with where you're listening from tonight and your local time. There's something quietly wonderful about knowing people are drifting off to prehistoric Earth from bedrooms all over the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture yourself standing on the eastern edge of Africa, somewhere in what will eventually become Ethiopia or Kenya, though right now those names mean nothing, because humans won't invent words for geography for a very long time. The air is warm, not uncomfortably so, but warm in that thick, living way that tells you the atmosphere here is full of things. Pollen, dust kicked up by enormous hooves, the faint chemical signals that animals use to communicate things like food here, and more relevantly tonight, danger here. The landscape stretching out before you is open, but not empty. It never was. It never will be. The grasslands of early Pleistocene Africa were what ecologists would later call a high-density predator environment, which is a very calm, scientific way of saying that an almost unreasonable number of things were actively hunting at any given moment. The savanna you're imagining, golden grasses, scattered acacia trees, wide open skies, was not the peaceful postcard it might appear. It was, in the most literal sense, a system. Every creature in it occupied a role, and for your ancestors at this particular moment in history, that role was not especially flattering. Here is a widely accepted and slightly sobering scientific fact. Early hominins, including Homo habilis, one of the earliest members of our genus, walking around right about now, are now understood to have been prey animals for much of their early evolutionary history. Not occasional prey, regular, expected, accounted for prey. The fossil record has given us bones of early human relatives with tooth marks on them, not human tooth marks, the other kind, and here is the part that surprises most people. The predators doing the hunting weren't just lions. 2 million years ago, the cast of predators sharing this landscape was so varied, so layered, and so extraordinarily well-equipped that it almost reads like the planet was overachieving. There were saber-toothed cats with canine teeth the length of your hand. There were hyenas, larger than any alive today, powerful enough to crack bone, that would defeat a modern spotted hyena without effort. There were giant raptors overhead. There were things in the rivers. The predator pressure on early hominins came from every direction simultaneously: ground, sky, water, which is, you have to admit, a lot. But here is something that scientists still debate: exactly how much of early hominin behavior was shaped by predator pressure versus other environmental stressors, like climate fluctuation or resource competition. Some researchers argue that constant predation was the single greatest driver of early human social evolution, that we became smart, communicative, and cooperative specifically because the alternative was being eaten. Others suggest predation was only one pressure among many, and that the full picture is considerably more complicated. The honest answer, as is often the case in paleoanthropology, is that we don't entirely know. The bones tell us some things. They don't tell us everything. What they do tell us is this: 2 million years ago, the world was not organized around human comfort. It was organized around energy transfer. Who ate what, who ate whom, and who managed to avoid being part of that equation long enough to reproduce. Your ancestors threaded that needle. Barely, at times, but they did, and the story of how they managed it, night after night and season after season, on a continent that was actively trying to renegotiate their place in the food chain, is one of the quieter miracles in the history of life on Earth. The grasslands are warm. The sky is enormous. Something moves in the tree line to your left, and whatever it is larger than you expected. That feeling, that quiet, animal alertness, is older than language. Tonight, we're going to sit with it for a while. There is a particular kind of awe that comes from standing next to something truly large. Not large like a delivery truck or large like a particularly ambitious oak tree, but large in the way that makes your nervous system quietly remind you that size in the animal kingdom has always meant something important. 2 million years ago, that feeling would have been essentially constant, because the defining biological characteristic of the Pleistocene, the feature that makes this era so endlessly fascinating to paleontologists and so deeply inconvenient for anything small and soft, is the phenomenon scientists call megafauna, big animals, extraordinarily, almost philosophically big animals. The word megafauna simply means large fauna, large animals, and by convention, it typically refers to creatures weighing over 44 kilograms, or roughly 100 pounds. But that definition, technically accurate as it is, undersells the Pleistocene considerably, because the megafauna of this era weren't just large. They were large in ways that cascaded outward, reshaping landscapes, redirecting rivers, compacting soil, felling trees, and fundamentally restructuring every ecosystem they moved through. They were large in ways that made them, effectively, forces of nature wearing fur. So, why did animals get so big? The honest answer is that scientists still debate the precise combination of factors, but several leading explanations have strong support. One involves climate. The Pleistocene was a period of dramatic temperature fluctuation, cycling between glacial periods, ice ages, and warmer interglacial periods. In colder climates, larger body size is thermodynamically advantageous. A bigger body has a lower surface area to volume ratio, meaning it loses heat more slowly. This principle, known as Bergmann's rule, helps explain why so many Pleistocene megafauna were concentrated in northern latitudes and cold grassland environments. Being enormous was, in a meaningful sense, a survival strategy written into the physics of staying warm. But size had another advantage that matters enormously for tonight's story. Large animals are harder to kill. A creature weighing several tons requires a predator of remarkable capability, coordination, or patience to bring down. And so, as prey animals grew larger over evolutionary time, predators were pulled upward in size and sophistication right alongside them. The Pleistocene became, essentially, an arms race written in bone and muscle, each side of the predator-prey equation pushing the other toward greater extremes. The result was an ecosystem of staggering intensity, enormous herbivores browsing and grazing across vast territories, and enormous predators evolving increasingly specialized tools to hunt them. Here is where things get interesting for your ancestors. Early hominins existed in this landscape, not as architects of it, not as its apex predators, but as relatively small, relatively slow, remarkably unarmored participants in a system built around creatures many times their size. Homo habilis stood roughly 1 to 1.5 meters tall. It weighed perhaps 25 to 35 kilograms. It had no claws worth mentioning, no meaningful natural armor, no venom, no extraordinary speed. What it had, what your ancestors had, was a brain slightly larger than its predecessors, and a growing capacity for something that, in time, would prove more useful than any of those things. But we'll get to that. For now, just appreciate the scale problem. Consider some of the neighbors your ancestors shared this landscape with. Deinotherium, a relative of modern elephants, stood over 4 meters at the shoulder and may have weighed upward of 12 tons, making it one of the largest land mammals to ever exist. It had downward curving tusks that it likely used to strip bark from trees, which sounds peaceful enough until you consider that something that large moving through a forest sounds less like an animal and more like a slow-motion collapse. Sharing the landscape with it wasn't dangerous so much as it was humbling. You were not the largest thing here. You were not even in the conversation. Then there were the giant buffalo, Pelorovis antiquus, with horn spans stretching over 2 meters from tip to tip. Grazing animals, yes, but animals that, when threatened or cornered, became genuinely catastrophic. A wounded or defensive Pelorovis represented a danger that no early hominin equipped with sharpened stones could realistically manage alone. And yet fossil evidence suggests early humans did occasionally attempt to scavenge or hunt these animals, which says something remarkable about either early human ingenuity or early human optimism, depending on how you look at it. Here is the lesser-known fact that tends to catch people off guard. The Pleistocene megafauna weren't confined to Africa. This was a global phenomenon. South America had its own extraordinary cast of enormous creatures. North America hosted things that modern visitors to those landscapes simply cannot picture. Even islands, which today tend toward smaller fauna over time, had their own megafauna in some cases, giant versions of species that shrank only after particular pressures arrived. The enormous animal era was, in a real sense, the default state of the planet for millions of years. What we have today, comparatively speaking, is the quiet aftermath, and through all of it, your ancestors walked carefully. They scanned the horizon constantly. They chose sleeping sites with attention to elevation and visibility. They were, in every meaningful sense, small creatures in a large world, and the large world had no particular interest in making things easy for them. Something enormous moves through the grass to the east. The ground carries the vibration of it before the sound arrives. Your ancestors knew that feeling. They organized their entire lives around it. If the megafauna herbivores of the early Pleistocene made your ancestors feel small, the predators sharing that same landscape made them feel something considerably more urgent. Because while a 4-meter elephant relative was alarming in the way that a thunderstorm is alarming, large, indifferent, dangerous if you were in the wrong place, the predators of 2 million years ago were alarming in a much more specific and personal way. They were alarming in the way that involves being noticed, being tracked, being chosen. The savanna of early Pleistocene Africa was not a place with 1 or 2 dangerous predators patrolling it. It was a place with a layered, overlapping community of hunters, each occupying a slightly different ecological niche, each with its own hunting style, its own preferred prey, its own hours of activity. From the perspective of a small, slow, largely defenseless hominin trying to move across that landscape, the effect was something like navigating a city where every street has different traffic rules, and some of the traffic is actively interested in you. Let's start with the one that has captured human imagination most thoroughly, the saber-toothed cat. Specifically, in the African context of 2 million years ago, we are primarily talking about Megantherion and the somewhat later Homotherium, two members of the Machaerodont family whose defining feature was, of course, those extraordinary canine teeth. And here is the thing about saber teeth that popular imagery tends to get slightly wrong. Those canines were not simply large versions of normal cat teeth. They were specialized instruments, flattened and serrated along the edges in many species, designed not for the crushing bite of a modern lion, but for a precise, devastating slash to soft tissue, most likely the throat or underbelly of prey animals. They were, in effect, biological cutting tools of remarkable efficiency. Megantherion was roughly the size of a modern jaguar, compact and powerfully built, likely an ambush predator that relied on concealment and explosive speed over short distances. It almost certainly targeted prey much larger than itself, which is a strategy that requires either extraordinary confidence or extraordinary capability, and the fossil evidence suggests Megantherion had the latter. What made it particularly relevant to early hominins wasn't just its hunting ability, but its preferred habitat, the broken woodland and bush edges that early humans also favored for the shelter and visibility they provided. The same landscape features that made a location attractive to a small hominin group made it attractive to Megantherion. They were, uncomfortably often, looking for the same real estate. But the saber-toothed cats, dramatic as they were not necessarily the most significant predator threat your ancestors faced on a day-to-day basis. That distinction may belong to the hyenas, and not the hyenas you're picturing. 2 million years ago, Africa hosted Pachyrhina brevirostris, a hyena that stood nearly a meter at the shoulder and weighed upward of 100 kilograms, roughly twice the size of a modern spotted hyena. It had a skull and jaw architecture that generated bite forces capable of crushing the long bones of large bovids to access the marrow inside. It was not, primarily, a scavenger in the way modern hyenas are sometimes caricatured. It was an active, capable predator in its own right, and it operated in groups. Here is the lesser-known fact that tends to reframe the entire predator landscape of this period. Paleontologists have found evidence suggesting that Pachyrhina and similar giant hyenas may have been the dominant large predators of some early Pleistocene environments, not lions, not saber-toothed cats, but hyenas. The accumulation of bones at certain fossil sites, including the famous site of Dmanisi in Georgia, where some of the earliest human remains outside Africa were found, shows patterns consistent with giant hyena activity. Your ancestors were not just occasionally brushing past hyena territory. They were living inside it. Then there were the lions, or rather, the lion-like felids of the period, which were in some cases significantly larger than modern African lions. Panthera leo was already present in some form, but earlier relatives and contemporaries were formidable in their own right, hunting in coordinated groups across open grassland in ways that made the savanna genuinely dangerous at all hours. Lions, unlike most predators, are comfortable hunting in daylight. They are comfortable hunting at night. They are, essentially, comfortable hunting whenever something worth hunting presents itself, which is a quality that makes them exhausting neighbors. Scientists still debate the precise predator guild structure of early Pleistocene Africa, which species were dominant in which environments, how much overlap and competition existed between them, and how that competition shaped their respective hunting strategies. What is reasonably clear is that the density and diversity of large predators in this period was significantly higher than anything existing on Earth today. Modern Africa, for all its remarkable wildlife, is a shadow of what that predator community once looked like, and threading through all of it, between the ambush sites of the saber-toothed, around the territory boundaries of the giant hyenas, across the open ground where lion groups rested in the afternoon heat, were your ancestors, watching, listening, reading the landscape the way you might read a room. When you walk in and immediately sense something is wrong, that instinct, that constant environmental vigilance, is something evolution spent millions of years installing. On nights like tonight, when everything is soft and safe, and the most dangerous thing nearby is a slightly sharp corner of a coffee table, it mostly runs quietly in the background, but it's still there. There is a story that gets told about human evolution, a very satisfying, very flattering story, in which our ancestors strode purposefully across the ancient landscape, tools in hand, intelligence blazing, gradually and inevitably asserting dominance over a world that was essentially waiting for them to arrive and take charge. It is a compelling story. It is also, for the period we are discussing tonight, almost entirely backwards. 2 million years ago, the relationship between early hominins and the concept of dominance was not one of possession. It was one of aspiration at best. And on most days, it wasn't even that. The emerging scientific consensus, built carefully from decades of fossil analysis, isotope studies, and site excavation, paints a picture of early Homo that is considerably more humble than the heroic narrative suggests. Your ancestors at this point in history were not the hunters. They were, with uncomfortable regularity, the hunted. They occupied a position in the predator-prey hierarchy that modern ecologists would classify as mesopredator at best, a creature that does some hunting of smaller or weaker animals, while simultaneously remaining prey for larger, more capable hunters above it in the food chain. Think less lion, more coyote, and even that comparison is generous for much of this period. The fossil evidence for this is not subtle. Bones of Homo habilis and its contemporaries have been recovered bearing tooth marks that tell an unambiguous story. At sites across eastern and southern Africa, hominin remains show scoring and puncture patterns consistent with large felid predation, the specific signature of a cat's teeth applied to bone in the particular way that happens when an animal is being consumed rather than merely scavenged. Some specimens show evidence of having been dragged, cached in trees, in the manner that modern leopards use to store prey away from competing scavengers. The picture that assembles from these details is not comfortable, but it is honest. Here is a widely accepted scientific fact that reframes the entire trajectory of human evolution. For a significant portion of early Homo history, our ancestors were not driving ecological change in their environments. They were responding to it. The animals shaping those African landscapes 2 million years ago were the great herbivores and the apex predators. Early hominins were passengers in that system, surviving through a combination of behavioral flexibility, social cooperation, and what can only be described as extraordinarily stubborn persistence in the face of a world that kept presenting them with reasons to give up. And yet, and this is where the story quietly becomes remarkable, they did not give up. The archaeological and fossil record shows a lineage that, despite consistent predator pressure, despite environmental instability, despite the lack of any obvious physical advantage over its competitors, kept finding ways to persist. Population sizes were small, ranges were wide, groups moved frequently, responded rapidly to changing conditions, and demonstrated a behavioral plasticity that their more physically impressive contemporaries often lacked. When the saber-toothed cat was essentially locked into its specialized hunting strategy by millions of years of evolutionary investment, your ancestors were improvising. The question of exactly when hominins shifted from being primarily prey to being primarily predators is one that scientists still debate with considerable energy. Some researchers point to evidence suggesting that regular organized hunting of large game began surprisingly early, perhaps 1.5 to 2 million years ago, with the appearance of more sophisticated tool technologies. Others argue that the shift was much more gradual, and that even relatively late members of the Homo lineage were still spending a significant portion of their dietary effort on scavenging rather than active hunting. The honest middle ground is that there was probably no single moment of transition. It was a slow rebalancing, varying by region and group and circumstance, playing out over hundreds of thousands of years. What we do know is that early Homo habilis, the hominin most relevant to our opening moment 2 million years ago, was doing something that its predecessors had not quite managed. It was using stone tools with enough regularity and intention to leave a recognizable archaeological signature. The Oldowan tool tradition, named for Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where many early examples were found, represents the earliest known stone tool technology, consisting of simple but deliberately shaped flakes and choppers created by striking one stone against another at precise angles. These tools could cut through hide and separate meat from bone with an efficiency that bare hands simply cannot match. But here is the subtler point that often gets lost in the excitement about stone tools. Those early tools were almost certainly used primarily for processing carcasses that hominins had not themselves killed. Scavenging, moving in after a predator had made a kill and abandoned or temporarily left the carcass, was likely a central food acquisition strategy for early Homo, which means your ancestors were doing something genuinely dangerous. They were walking up to the recent kills of saber-toothed cats and giant hyenas and attempting to extract nutrition from them before the original hunter returned or a competing scavenger arrived. It required speed, coordination, excellent threat assessment, and a willingness to take risks that, viewed from a comfortable modern bedroom, seems almost unreasonably bold. The savannah didn't reward timidity. It also didn't particularly reward recklessness. What it rewarded, slowly and over enormous spans of time, was the particular combination of social intelligence, flexible behavior, and risk-calibrated boldness that your ancestors managed to sustain. Not every group, not every season, but enough. Just barely enough. That margin, that razor-thin difference between enough and not enough, is the entire reason you exist tonight. There is a particular quality of attention that comes with being prey, not the distracted, half-present awareness of someone glancing occasionally at their surroundings, but something older and sharper and considerably more total, a full-body alertness in which every sense is quietly running in parallel, processing the environment for information that might matter very quickly. You almost certainly don't experience this in your daily life. Your nervous system has it available, dusty and somewhat underused, filed somewhere beneath your anxiety about emails and your mild concern about whether you left the stove on. But 2 million years ago, that quality of attention was not optional. It was the baseline. It was the price of moving through the world at all. Your ancestors navigated the early Pleistocene landscape through a combination of sensory vigilance and learned environmental knowledge that, when you examine it carefully, represents one of the most sophisticated survival systems that evolution had produced up to that point. It wasn't physical. Early hominins couldn't outrun a saber-toothed cat, couldn't outmuscle a giant hyena, couldn't intimidate an animal 10 times their weight with any reliable success. What they could do, what they were, in fact, becoming increasingly exceptional at, was read the landscape. And reading the landscape, in this context, was a matter of life and death, in the most immediate possible sense. Consider what a patch of tall grass means to a creature that understands predators. To a grazing herbivore, tall grass is food, concealment, comfort. To a large predator, tall grass is a hunting platform, a place to compress distance without being seen. To an early hominin with a functioning threat assessment system, tall grass is a question that demands an answer before you walk past it. The question is not simply, is something in there? The question is, what does everything around this grass tell me about whether something is in there? The behavior of birds, the direction of the wind, the posture of other herbivores nearby, the absence of sound where sound should be. These are all data points, and your ancestors were learning to aggregate them with increasing sophistication. Here is a widely accepted scientific fact that reframes how we think about early human cognition. Researchers studying modern hunter-gatherer communities have documented a form of environmental literacy, the ability to read landscapes, animal behavior, weather patterns, and ecological indicators that operates with a richness and precision that formal scientific training doesn't automatically replicate. This capacity almost certainly has deep evolutionary roots. The ancestors of those modern people were doing versions of the same reading 2 million years ago in landscapes far more immediately dangerous, which means the skill was being selected for and refined over an enormous span of time. Being good at reading the environment kept you alive. Being bad at it did not. The tall grass problem was real and constant. The African savanna is not uniformly open. It is a mosaic, patches of open ground alternating with dense vegetation, dry stream beds lined with thicket, copious rising from the grassland with their broken rock providing both shelter and ambush positions, woodland edges where light shifts and visibility drops suddenly. Moving through this landscape required constant route planning, constant threat triangulation, and a kind of spatial memory that tracked not just where you had been, but what had been present there, and how recently your ancestors were building mental maps, not just of geography, but of danger, layered, updated, shared within their social group through whatever communication systems they had available. And here is the part that tends to surprise people. The threat wasn't always visible. Sometimes it was audible. A specific alarm call from a vervet monkey carries different information depending on whether the threat is aerial or terrestrial. Modern vervets have distinct calls for eagles versus leopards versus snakes, and research suggests this kind of referential signaling may be widespread among savanna animals. Early hominins sharing that landscape would have had every evolutionary incentive to recognize and respond to those signals, effectively borrowing threat intelligence from the broader animal community around them. The savanna was not silent. It was full of information if you knew how to listen. Here is the lesser-known fact that consistently catches people off guard. Some researchers have proposed that the development of long-distance running in early Homo, the remarkable human capacity for sustained endurance running that no other primate matches, may have been driven at least partly by predator evasion, rather than, or in addition to, persistence hunting of prey. The ability to cover ground quickly over long distances to outdistance a pursuing predator that relies on short explosive bursts would have had obvious survival value in a landscape where the predators were faster over short distances but limited in endurance. Your body's ability to run a marathon, which feels like a purely athletic achievement in the modern world, may have originated partly as an escape mechanism. Scientists still debate the relative contributions of predator evasion versus hunting in driving the evolution of human endurance running. And the question is unlikely to be fully resolved, given the nature of the fossil evidence available. What the anatomy strongly supports is that by the time of Homo erectus, slightly later than our 2 million year opening, the human body was being reshaped in ways that made sustained locomotion increasingly efficient. Longer legs, shorter toes, the neutral ligament stabilizing the head during running, sweat glands capable of thermoregulation during extended exertion. The body was being rebuilt for a world that required covering distance. The grass moves, not the whole field, just one section, perhaps 30 meters to your left. A gentle lateral displacement that doesn't match the direction of the wind. Your ancestors noticed things like that. They noticed the specific wrongness of it within moments, processed the available information, and made a decision about whether to investigate, avoid, or alert the group. They got that decision right, on balance, enough times to matter. You are the result of every correct decision, every single one. Just when you thought the situation couldn't become more comprehensively inconvenient, it's worth pausing to look upward. Because in the catalog of threats facing early hominins 2 million years ago, the danger was not exclusively horizontal. It came from above as well, delivered by creatures that turned the open African sky into something considerably less peaceful than it appears on a clear morning. Your ancestors, already navigating a landscape patrolled by saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, and lion-like felids at ground level, also had to contend with the aerial dimension of predation, and the Pleistocene, consistent with its general philosophy of excess, had made that dimension genuinely alarming. The most discussed aerial predator in the context of early human ancestors is Stephanoatus coronatus, the crowned eagle, or more precisely, its Pleistocene relatives and ancestors, which were in some cases significantly larger than the modern species. The crowned eagle today is already a remarkable and somewhat unsettling bird. It is the most powerful eagle in Africa relative to its size, capable of killing prey several times its own body weight through a combination of extraordinarily strong talons, precise strike targeting, and a hunting strategy that involves approaching from concealment and delivering an immediate, disabling grip to the skull or spine of its target. Modern crowned eagles are documented to occasionally prey on small children in areas where their habitat overlaps with human settlement. 2 million years ago, their ancestors were larger, the prey was smaller, and the open woodland habitat your ancestors favored was also exactly the hunting territory these birds preferred. The fossil evidence connecting large raptors to early hominin predation is both specific and striking. At the site of Taung in South Africa, the famous Taung child, a juvenile Australopithecus africanus, whose skull has been studied extensively since its discovery in 1924, shows damage patterns on the eye sockets and skull that a pair of researchers identified in the early 2000s as consistent with eagle predation. The specific pattern of puncture marks and scoring matched the talon strike signature of large eagles observed on modern monkey skulls recovered from beneath eagle nest sites. The Taung child, one of the most important fossil specimens in paleoanthropology, may have ended its life as an eagle's meal. That detail, when you sit with it, is quietly extraordinary. Here is the widely accepted scientific fact that gives this aerial threat its full context. Large birds of prey use a hunting strategy fundamentally different from terrestrial predators, and that difference created specific defensive challenges for early hominins. A terrestrial predator can often be detected by sound, scent, disturbed vegetation, or the alarm responses of other animals. A large raptor approaching from height against a bright sky, following a steep dive that covers the final distance in under a second, offers almost none of those advance warnings. The threat arrives essentially without announcement. The only reliable defense is either dense overhead cover, staying beneath trees or rocky overhangs, or the kind of group vigilance that comes from having multiple individuals scanning different portions of the environment simultaneously. This is one reason researchers believe that group living was not merely socially convenient for early hominins, but functionally critical for survival. A solitary individual has one set of eyes, one field of attention, one capacity for threat detection. A group of 8 or 10 individuals, even without any formal coordination, provides overlapping sensory coverage of the environment in multiple directions and dimensions simultaneously. The alarm response of one group member becomes immediately available to all others. The raptor that might successfully target an isolated individual faces a much more complex calculation when that individual is surrounded by others who are also watching the sky, and there were other aerial threats beyond the eagle relatives. Gyps vultures and their relatives, while not active predators of healthy adults, would have been constant environmental presences, their circling behavior serving as aerial advertisement for the location of carcasses, information that was simultaneously useful to scavenging hominins and to the predators that might be drawn to the same location. Reading vulture behavior would have been another layer of environmental literacy, another signal in the constant stream of information your ancestors were processing. Vultures descending meant food available. Vultures circling without descending meant something large and dangerous was still present at the kill site. The sky was not just dangerous, it was communicative, if you understood its language. Here is the lesser-known fact that reframes the overhead threat in an unexpected direction. Some researchers have proposed that the human aesthetic response to open skies, the instinctive comfort most people feel beneath trees or covered spaces versus in exposed open areas, may have deep evolutionary roots in exactly this kind of aerial predation pressure. The preference for dappled shade, for sitting with your back against something solid, for choosing seats in restaurants that face the door rather than expose your back to the room. These small, automatic, comfort-seeking behaviors may be extremely ancient. Your nervous system, shaped by millions of years of living in environments where the threat could come from above, may still be quietly running threat assessments about overhead exposure, even in situations where the most dangerous thing in the sky is a passing cloud. Scientists still debate the degree to which specific behavioral preferences in modern humans can be traced to particular ancestral selection pressures, and the field is appropriately cautious about drawing straight lines between ancient predation and modern psychology. The connections are plausible and intriguing, but the evidence is necessarily indirect. What is much clearer is that early hominins, living under genuine aerial predation pressure, would have developed strong behavioral tendencies around overhead cover and group vigilance, and that those tendencies, whatever their downstream expression in modern humans, were survival critical at the time. The sky above the early Pleistocene savanna is enormous and deeply blue, crossed by thermals that carry large wings in slow, patient circles. Your ancestors learned to read those circles the way you might read a weather forecast. Not always pleasant news, but information you needed to have. Water is a fundamental problem when you are a small, vulnerable creature in a dangerous world. Not because water itself is hostile. Though early Pleistocene Africa had its share of flash floods and unpredictable, seasonal flooding that complicated life considerably. But because water is a resource so essential that every living thing in the landscape is drawn to it, and when everything in the landscape is drawn to a single location, including the things with large teeth and considerable patience, that location becomes something considerably more complicated than simply a place to drink. 2 million years ago, the rivers, lakes, and seasonal waterholes of eastern and southern Africa were simultaneously the most important and most dangerous places in the world for your ancestors. Visiting them was not optional. Visiting them safely required everything your ancestors had. The African Rift Valley, which was forming and deepening during this period through volcanic and tectonic activity, created an extraordinary series of lakes, rivers, and wetlands that shaped the entire ecological story of early human evolution. The lakes of this region, ancestors of modern lakes like Turkana, Tanganyika, and Victoria, were not just water sources, they were ecosystem engines, supporting enormous concentrations of fish, birds, amphibians, and the full cascade of predators that fed on them. The shorelines and riverbanks of these water bodies were among the most productive and most dangerous environments on the continent. Fossil sites near ancient lake margins consistently yield extraordinary concentrations of both animal remains and early hominin artifacts, which tells you two things simultaneously. Your ancestors were spending significant time near water, and so was everything else. The crocodilians of the early Pleistocene deserve particular attention because the modern Nile crocodile, already a formidable and dangerous animal, responsible for a significant number of human fatalities each year, was sharing its ancient environment with relatives that were, in some cases, considerably larger. Crocodilus thorbjarnarsoni, sometimes called the giant crocodile, is estimated from fossil remains to have reached lengths of 7 to 8 meters and weights potentially exceeding a ton. To put that in immediate physical terms, a modern Nile crocodile at 5 meters is already among the most dangerous ambush predators on Earth. A crocodilian 50% longer and proportionally heavier represents a threat category that operates somewhat beyond normal planning. Here is a widely accepted scientific fact that restructures how you think about early hominin water access. Crocodilians are extraordinarily patient ambush predators whose hunting strategy relies on a prey animal's need to approach the water's edge. They do not need to chase. They do not need to track. They simply need to wait, partially submerged, visually indistinguishable from a floating log in low-contrast lighting conditions, until something comes to drink. The prey animal's own survival need, its requirement for water, becomes the mechanism of its predation. For early hominins, who needed to visit water sources regularly and who were not substantially larger than the crocodilians' other preferred prey, this represented a threat that was essentially impossible to eliminate. It could only be managed through timing, group behavior, vigilance, and the selection of access points that minimized exposure. The water also contained other threats that tend to receive less dramatic attention, but were ecologically significant. Hippopotamuses, present in the early Pleistocene in forms similar to the modern species, are not predators in the conventional sense, but are among the most dangerous large animals in Africa today, responsible for more human fatalities than most actual predators. A hippo's territorial aggression in and around water, its capacity for explosive speed over short distances on land, and its habit of surfacing unpredictably beneath boats and riverbank visitors made water margins with hippo populations genuinely treacherous. Early hominins, collecting shellfish, fishing, or simply attempting to fill a carried container with water, would have needed to account for hippo presence in any location where the vegetation and water depth suited them. Here is the lesser-known fact that reshapes the entire picture of early hominin water use. Isotopic analysis of early hominin teeth has revealed that some individuals consumed significant quantities of aquatic foods, fish, shellfish, aquatic plants, suggesting that water margins were not merely occasional, high-risk stops for drinking, but were actually important foraging environments where early humans invested meaningful time and effort. This is significant because aquatic foods, particularly shellfish and fish, are rich in the omega-3 fatty acids and iodine that researchers have linked to brain development. Some scientists have proposed that regular access to aquatic food sources may have been a contributing factor in the expansion of early human brain size over this period. That the same dangerous lake shores your ancestors risked their lives to visit may have been providing the specific nutrients that were literally building bigger, more capable brains. Scientists still debate the extent to which aquatic food consumption influenced human cognitive evolution, and the evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive. The isotopic data is real and interesting. The causal chain from shellfish to brain power is plausible, but not definitively established. What the data does clearly show is that early hominins were willing to accept significant predation risk in exchange for the nutritional rewards of water margin environments. They were making a calculated trade, danger for nutrition, and making it regularly enough to leave a detectable signature in the chemistry of their bones and teeth. The riverbank at dusk is perhaps the most dangerous hour. The light is failing, which disadvantages the visually oriented hominin and advantages the crocodilian, whose heat sensing and pressure detecting systems perform equally well in darkness. The hippos are beginning their nightly emergence onto land to graze. Something large has been drinking upstream and has disturbed the water birds, whose sudden flight drew everyone's attention for a moment. Everyone on both sides of the predator-prey equation. Your ancestors needed water. They went to get it anyway. They brought others with them, watched different directions, moved quickly at the water's edge, and did not linger. The river runs quietly tonight. The surface looks calm. It always looks calm. One of the more conceptually satisfying things about modern ecosystems is that they have a certain legibility to them. You can look at the African savanna today and identify, with reasonable confidence, the apex predators, the mid-level predators, the primary consumers, the decomposers, and the various organisms threading through and between those categories. The hierarchy exists. It has exceptions and complications, but it is broadly readable. 2 million years ago, the equivalent exercise was considerably more complicated because the predator guild of the early Pleistocene was not a simple pyramid with a clear apex. It was something closer to a tangled web in which multiple large predators competed aggressively with each other, in which the boundaries between predator and scavenger were frequently blurred, and in which the position of early hominins was both peripheral and precarious in ways that shaped their behavior at every level. The technical term for the ecological layer your ancestors occupied is intra-guild competition, the conflict and competition between predators that share overlapping prey and resources. In modern Africa, intra-guild competition is visible in the relationship between lions and hyenas, or between leopards and cheetahs, where larger or more socially organized predators regularly steal kills from smaller ones, and where the mere presence of a dominant predator can suppress the behavior and movement of subordinate ones across large areas. 2 million years ago, this dynamic was operating at a much higher intensity, with more species involved, more overlap in prey preferences, and considerably less ecological simplification than today's comparatively impoverished predator community shows. Consider the practical implications for a group of early hominins attempting to scavenge a carcass. The sequence of events at a kill site in the early Pleistocene was not a simple two-party transaction between predator and scavenger. It was a rotating cast of interested parties, each arriving according to their own hierarchy, their own risk tolerance, and their own detection capabilities. A saber-toothed cat makes a kill in the early morning. It feeds partially, then rests nearby, guarding the carcass intermittently. Giant hyenas, detecting the kill through scent, carried on the morning wind, begin to gather at a cautious distance, their number gradually building until collective confidence allows an approach. Vultures arrive overhead, their circling advertising the location to every other interested party within visual range. Jackals probe the edges, and somewhere in this layered, dynamic, constantly renegotiating situation, a small group of hominins is attempting to assess whether a window of opportunity exists to dash in, use stone tools to separate meat from bone with maximum speed, and retreat before any of the other interested parties decide that the hominins themselves are more convenient than the carcass. Here is the widely accepted scientific fact that gives this picture its full weight. Researchers studying modern predator guild dynamics have found that scavenging opportunities for smaller subordinate species are highly dependent on the behavior and satiation state of dominant predators, and that those windows of opportunity are typically narrow, unpredictable, and competitively contested. For early hominins attempting to access large carcasses, success would have required not just detecting the kill site, but accurately reading the behavioral state of every other species present, anticipating their movements, and executing a rapid, coordinated extraction before the situation changed. This was not simple opportunism. It was sophisticated, real-time ecological assessment applied under extreme time pressure and physical danger. The giant hyena, Pachecracuda, complicates the picture further. Unlike modern spotted hyenas, which operate in complex social hierarchies with established dominance relationships, the behavioral ecology of Pachecracuda is not fully understood because behavior doesn't fossilize. What we can infer from its anatomy, the massive skull, the bone-crushing dentition, the body size suggesting significant physical capability, is that it was likely a dominant competitor at carcass sites, capable of displacing most other species from a kill through sheer physical presence. Early hominins encountering Prehistoric at a carcass site were not in a negotiating position. They were in a retreating position, and the speed and decisiveness of that retreat probably mattered considerably. Here is the lesser-known fact that reframes the predator shuffle in an unexpected way. Some researchers have proposed that early hominin stone tool use at carcass sites may have been specifically adapted to this competitive scavenging environment, that the speed and efficiency of Oldowan tools for processing carcasses was not primarily about nutritional optimization in a leisurely sense, but about competitive speed, getting the maximum nutrition off a carcass in the minimum time. Before displacement by a dominant competitor arrived, would have created strong selective pressure for tools that made carcass processing faster. The stone flake that lets you separate meat from bone in 30 seconds rather than 3 minutes isn't just convenient. In a world full of Prehistoric, it might be the difference between eating and not eating, or between eating and being eaten. Scientists still debate the relative importance of active hunting versus scavenging in early hominin diet, and the question is genuinely difficult to resolve because the archaeological signatures of the two behaviors can be difficult to distinguish cleanly. What the evidence increasingly suggests is that both strategies were employed flexibly, situationally, and that the ability to switch between them, depending on available opportunity, was itself an important adaptive capability. The carcass in the grass has been there since dawn. The vultures have been working the upper portions. The hyenas arrived an hour ago and displaced the original predator, which retreated to a rocky outcrop and is watching from there with a patience that is not especially comforting. The window, if there is one, is narrowing. Your ancestors are watching all of this from a distance, reading each animal's posture, tracking the wind direction, counting the hyenas, assessing the distance to the nearest trees. They are running calculations that have no numbers in them. Pure pattern recognition applied to a situation with lethal stakes. The window opens. Briefly, they move. There is something almost meditative about a stone tool, not in an abstract, philosophical sense, but in the very literal sense that making one requires a quality of focused, patient attention that feels almost out of place in a world of constant predator pressure and immediate survival demands. You take one stone, a hammer stone, typically rounded and dense, fitting comfortably in the palm, and you strike it against another stone at a precise angle, with a controlled force that is neither too gentle nor too forceful. And if the angle and force and the internal structure of the target stone are all correctly aligned, a sharp flake separates cleanly from the core. That flake, thin and curved, and bearing an edge that, under magnification, reveals a sharpness rivaling surgical steel, is the product of knowledge, practice, and a particular kind of three-dimensional spatial reasoning that, at the time it first appeared in the archaeological record, was genuinely new to the world. The Oldowan tool industry, named, as mentioned earlier, for Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, though examples have since been found across a wide swath of Africa and beyond, represents the earliest confirmed evidence of intentional stone tool manufacture, dating to approximately 2.6 million years ago. That date places the beginning of stone tool use slightly before the period we've been inhabiting tonight, which means that by the time of Homo habilis, 2 million years ago, stone tools were not a new invention, but an established, transmitted technology, something learned, practiced, and passed between individuals within social groups. The tools themselves were relatively simple by later standards. sharp flakes for cutting, core tools with rougher working edges for chopping, utilized flakes showing wear patterns consistent with processing plant material, bone and hide. Simple? Yes. Transformative? Absolutely. But here is the important qualification that often gets lost in the excitement of the earliest tools. The transformation they represented was not immediate. Stone tools did not abruptly elevate early hominins from prey to predator overnight, or over a generation, or even over many thousands of years. The change was real, but gradual, cumulative, and deeply dependent on the behavioral and social context in which the tools were used. A sharp stone flake in the hands of a solitary Homo habilis facing a giant hyena is not a meaningful defensive weapon. The same flake, used efficiently within a coordinated group to process a carcass in the 3 minutes before that hyena arrives, is genuinely life-changing. The tool's value was inseparable from the social and strategic framework surrounding its use. Here is a widely accepted scientific fact that reshapes how we think about early tool use. Microscopic analysis of wear patterns on Oldowan tools has revealed that they were used for a surprisingly diverse range of tasks: cutting meat, scraping hide, processing plant material, and working wood, suggesting that early tool users were applying this technology flexibly across different subsistence activities, rather than specializing narrowly. This behavioral flexibility, visible in the varied use-wear signatures on ancient stone surfaces, is itself significant. It suggests a cognitive architecture capable of recognizing that the same basic tool type could be adapted to multiple problems, which is a less obvious insight than it might initially appear. Applying existing solutions to new problems requires a mental model of the tool as an abstract category rather than a single-purpose object. The social transmission of tool-making knowledge deserves particular attention because it represents something genuinely new in the history of life on Earth. Other animals use tools. Chimpanzees strip twigs to fish termites from mounds. Certain crow species fashion hooks from wire. Sea otters use rocks to crack shellfish. But the Oldowan tradition represents something qualitatively different: a tool technology sufficiently complex that its reliable reproduction required active teaching, or at minimum sustained observational learning across generations, producing a cumulative technological tradition that persisted and slowly developed over hundreds of thousands of years. This is culture in the most fundamental sense. Information stored not in genes, but in the behavioral practices of social groups, transmitted forward through time by learning rather than inheritance. Here is the lesser-known fact that tends to surprise people. Some researchers have argued that the cognitive demands of Oldowan tool production, specifically the requirement to visualize the three-dimensional geometry of a stone core and plan a sequence of strikes to produce a desired flake, may have driven selection for the expanded working memory and sequential planning capabilities that distinguish human cognition from that of other primates. In other words, making stone tools may have made us smarter, not just better equipped. The tool shaped the toolmaker over time in both directions simultaneously. The hand that learned to knap flint was connected to a brain that was slowly, generation by generation, becoming more capable of the kind of extended, sequential reasoning that knapping required. Scientists still debate the cognitive requirements of Oldowan tool production specifically, and whether it genuinely exceeded the capabilities of other great apes or merely extended them in degree rather than kind. Experimental studies have attempted to teach captive bonobos and chimpanzees to produce stone flakes, with mixed and contested results that the field continues to interpret. What is clear is that the Oldowan tradition, whatever its precise cognitive underpinnings, persisted and spread across an enormous geographic range over a very long period, which is the clearest possible evidence that it was working. The tool sits in your ancestor's hand, newly struck, the edge still clean and sharp in the morning light. It is not impressive to look at. It would not frighten anything. It would not stop a charging predator or win a confrontation with a giant hyena, but pressed against the hide of a carcass at exactly the right angle, drawn along the natural seam between skin and underlying tissue, it does something that bare hands cannot. It opens the animal efficiently, quickly, before the window closes and the competitors arrive. Small advantages, compounded over time, become large ones. That is perhaps the quietest and most important lesson in all of human prehistory. There are very few moments in the entire history of life on Earth that represent a genuine discontinuity, a point at which the rules change so fundamentally that the world before and the world after are qualitatively different in ways that compound forward through time essentially without limit. The invention of stone tools was one such moment, quiet and gradual as its transformation was. The controlled use of fire was another, and its effect on the relationship between early humans and the dangerous world they inhabited was so comprehensive and so immediate that it deserves to be understood not just as a useful adaptation, but as something closer to a renegotiation of the terms by which humans participated in their ecosystem. Before fire, your ancestors were participants in a system that had been running without them for hundreds of millions of years. After fire, they were beginning, slowly and perhaps without any awareness of the magnitude of what they were doing, to edit that system. The question of when early humans first controlled fire is one that paleontologists and archaeologists have debated with considerable intensity, and the honest answer is that it depends somewhat on what you mean by controlled. The earliest persuasive evidence of fire use at a specific site comes from Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, where burnt bone and plant ash have been dated to approximately 1 million years ago. Some researchers have argued for even earlier fire use, pointing to burned material at sites in Kenya dating to perhaps 1.5 million years ago, though the evidence there is more ambiguous, and the debate about whether those fires were humanly controlled or naturally occurring remains active. What is reasonably clear is that by the time of Homo erectus, the hominin species that emerged around 1.8 to 2 million years ago and represents a significant step in the direction of modern humans, fire use was becoming part of the behavioral repertoire, at least in some populations and some environments. For tonight's purposes, the specific date matters less than the effect, because the effect of controlled fire on the predator-prey dynamics we've been exploring all evening was almost immediate and deeply structural. Consider what fire does to the nighttime landscape. Before fire, darkness was an equalizer that strongly favored predators. Most of the large predators your ancestors feared, the felids, the hyenas, the larger carnivores generally, had visual systems better adapted to low-light conditions than the hominin eye, which is optimized for color discrimination in daylight rather than sensitivity in darkness. Night was their domain, and early hominins without fire had very limited options for nighttime safety beyond choosing sleeping sites with natural defensibility, elevated rocky outcrops, trees, cave entrances, and huddling together in groups large enough to provide collective alarm systems. Fire changed all of that. a maintained fire at a sleeping site did several things simultaneously that restructured the nighttime threat environment. It provided light, extending the visual range of the humans maintaining it and reducing the concealment advantage that darkness gave approaching predators. It provided heat, which in cooler conditions reduced the physiological stress of nighttime rest and allowed more consolidated sleep. It produced smoke and unfamiliar sensory signals that most large predators, having had no evolutionary history with controlled fire, found deeply aversive. And it created a perimeter of psychological deterrence that operated continuously without requiring the active attention of any individual through the simple fact of its presence. Here is the widely accepted scientific fact that gives the fire story its full significance. Researchers studying the sleeping behavior of modern great apes, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, find that they spend considerable cognitive and physical energy selecting safe sleeping sites, frequently traveling significant distances to reach locations with adequate natural defensibility, and that the quality and security of sleeping sites has measurable effects on their health and reproductive success. Early hominins without fire faced the same challenge. Fire, by converting virtually any location into a defensible sleeping site, effectively decoupled hominin sleeping behavior from the geography of natural defensibility. Your ancestors could sleep somewhere convenient rather than somewhere safe, because fire made convenient places safe. Here is the lesser-known fact that consistently reframes the fire story in an unexpected direction. Some researchers have proposed that the regular use of fire for cooking, which appears to have begun at least by 1 million years ago, and possibly earlier, had profound effects not just on human ecology, but on human anatomy and cognition. Cooking dramatically increases the caloric availability of food. Cooked starches and proteins are substantially easier to digest than raw equivalents, which means that a cooked diet effectively provides more energy from the same quantity of food. This energetic surplus, the argument goes, supported the metabolic demands of an expanding brain while simultaneously reducing the size of the digestive system required to process a raw diet. The human gut is, by primate standards, remarkably short and energetically inexpensive for our body size. The human brain is, by any standard, remarkably large and energetically expensive. Fire-enabled cooking may have helped fund one with savings from the other. Scientists still debate the timeline and the mechanism of this dietary cognitive connection, and the hypothesis, associated most prominently with primatologist Richard Wrangham, while widely discussed, is not universally accepted. The anatomical correlations are real and intriguing. The causal chain is plausible, but difficult to test directly against the fossil record. What the evidence does clearly support is that the adoption of cooking was associated over time with significant changes in human anatomy that are consistent with reduced digestive demands and increased brain investment. The fire burns low in the darkness, its coals throwing a warm, irregular light across the faces of the sleeping group. Something large moves in the darkness beyond the firelight's reach. You can hear it, a slow displacement of dry grass, a pause, then stillness. It does not come closer. Whatever calculation it is running about the orange light and the unfamiliar smell and the huddled shapes within the circle of warmth, the answer it arrives at is the same answer it has arrived at before. It turns away. It finds something else. Your ancestors sleep. Not peacefully exactly. Sleep in the Pleistocene was probably never fully peaceful in the way yours can be tonight. But they sleep. And that, for this moment in this landscape, is everything. There is a particular kind of discovery that early human populations must have made, repeatedly and across many generations, as they moved beyond the familiar landscapes of eastern Africa into territories that no hominin had ever visited. It is the discovery that the world, in its extraordinary generosity toward the concept of large dangerous animals, had not confined its most impressive predators and most intimidating megafauna to the single continent your ancestors knew. Every new landscape they entered had its own welcoming committee. Every new ecosystem had organized itself around its own cast of enormous, capable, deeply inconvenient creatures, none of whom had any prior experience with humans, and therefore none of whom had any particular reason to be cautious about them. The expansion of early humans beyond Africa was not a triumphal march into empty territory. It was a series of introductions, most of them uncomfortable, to animals that had been running their respective ecosystems without interruption for millions of years and had not been consulted about the new arrivals. The earliest confirmed movement of hominins out of Africa involves Homo erectus, whose remains have been found at Dmanisi in Georgia, dating to approximately 1.8 million years ago, making those individuals the earliest known humans outside Africa, and placing their arrival in the Caucasus region right at the opening edge of the period we've been exploring tonight. What Dmanisi offers, beyond the extraordinary hominin fossils themselves, is a window into the predator community those early travelers encountered upon leaving Africa. The site has yielded remains of giant cheetah-like felids, large bear relatives, and saber-toothed cats, a predator guild that was different in its specific cast of characters from the African community, but equally layered, equally dangerous, and equally unimpressed by the arrival of small, relatively slow hominins from the south. Europe and Asia, during the early to Middle Pleistocene, hosted their own remarkable megafauna assemblages. The cave lion, Panthera spelaea, was larger than any modern lion, ranging across Eurasia in a distribution that eventually extended from Western Europe into Northern Asia and ultimately across the land bridge into North America. Cave bears, Ursus spelaeus, were enormous, significantly larger than modern brown bears, and while primarily herbivorous in their diet, they were formidable competitors for the cave shelters that later human populations also prized for winter refuge. The competition between early European humans and cave bears for suitable shelter is one of the more evocative conflicts in prehistoric history, playing out over tens of thousands of years in the limestone cave systems of Western Europe, with both species leaving their marks, literally in the case of the bear's claw scratches on cave walls, and the human's extraordinary art on the same stone surfaces. Here is a widely accepted scientific fact that restructures how we think about early human expansion. The megafauna assemblages of Eurasia, while different in their specific species composition from those of Africa, were in many ways more challenging for expanding human populations, precisely because they were unfamiliar. African hominins had co-evolved with their predators over millions of years, developing behavioral responses, threat assessment systems, and avoidance strategies calibrated to specific animals in specific landscapes. Moving into Europe or Asia meant encountering predators whose behavioral patterns, hunting strategies, habitat preferences, and territorial ranges were entirely unknown. The learned environmental literacy that kept your ancestors alive in Eastern Africa had to be rebuilt. From observation, in every new landscape they entered, Asia presented its own extraordinary cast. The giant panda's ancestors were more carnivorous than their modern descendants. Gigantopithecus, a primate of truly remarkable size, potentially 3 meters tall and weighing several hundred kilograms, existed in southeastern Asia until surprisingly recently in geological terms, though it was almost certainly a herbivore and probably not a direct threat to humans. More immediately relevant were the large felids, hyenas, and bears of the Asian interior, plus the specific challenges of the Asian megafauna that included giant deer with antler spans that stagger the imagination, various large bovids, and the elephantid relatives that occupied Asian forests in considerable numbers and variety. Here is the lesser-known fact that tends to reframe the entire story of human expansion. Some researchers have proposed that the movement of early Homo erectus populations out of Africa and into Eurasia may have occurred faster than the fossil record currently suggests, that the gaps in our evidence represent the limitations of fossilization and discovery rather than actual gaps in the human presence. If that interpretation is correct, it means that early humans were adapting to entirely new megafauna communities at a pace that left relatively little time for the gradual behavioral calibration that their African experience had provided. They were learning new predators quickly, under selection pressure in real time. The ones who learned fast enough left descendants. The ones who did not left nothing. The landscape of early Pleistocene Eurasia was not merely Africa with different labels. It was a different world, organized around different evolutionary histories, shaped by different climate patterns, and patrolled by creatures that had never seen anything quite like the small, upright, increasingly tool-using animals making their way northward and eastward from a distant continent. Those animals, the cave lions, the cave bears, the giant deer, the various felids and canids and ursids of the Eurasian interior, had their own ecological logic, their own seasonal rhythms, their own territorial structures, and your ancestors walked into the middle of all of it with stone tools, increasing social sophistication, the beginnings of fire use, and the same stubborn, flexible, improvisational intelligence that had kept them alive in Africa. It wasn't always enough. Some groups almost certainly ended there, in unfamiliar valleys or beside rivers whose flood patterns they hadn't yet learned, taken by predators whose behavioral signatures they hadn't yet decoded. The fossil record of early human expansion is, among other things, a record of the attempts that succeeded. The attempts that didn't succeed left no record at all. That asymmetry between the stories we can tell and the ones that ended without continuation is worth sitting with quietly for a moment. At some point during this evening's journey through a world that was comprehensively organized around eating your ancestors, you may have noticed a recurring element in nearly every survival strategy we've discussed. The fire was more effective with multiple people maintaining it. The carcass could only be processed quickly enough with coordinated group effort. The aerial threat from large raptors was best managed through overlapping vigilance from multiple individuals scanning different portions of the sky. The giant hyenas were more likely to be deterred by a group than by a solitary individual. Reading all of those situations carefully, a pattern emerges that is so consistent and so fundamental that it deserves its own dedicated attention. The single most important survival technology available to early hominins 2 million years ago was not stone tools, was not fire, was not any particular physical capability or behavioral trick. It was each other. Group living is not unique to humans. Social behavior appears across the animal kingdom in forms ranging from the loose aggregations of schooling fish to the extraordinarily sophisticated cooperative societies of social insects. Among primates, sociality is essentially universal. Every living primate species lives in some form of social group, and the benefits of group living in terms of predator defense, resource location, and reproductive success are well documented across the literature. What makes early hominin sociality interesting, and what makes it specifically relevant to the survival challenges we've been examining tonight, is the particular direction in which it was developing during this period toward a form of social organization that was becoming increasingly flexible, increasingly communicative, and increasingly capable of generating coordinated responses to complex, dynamic threats. The basic mathematics of group predator defense are straightforward. A predator approaching a solitary individual has a 100% chance of selecting that individual as its target. A predator approaching a group of 10 individuals has, at minimum, a substantially reduced probability of successfully targeting any specific individual, and faces the additional complications of multiple alarm responses, potential mobbing behavior, and the confusion that comes from trying to focus on a single target in a moving, reacting group. This is the dilution effect, and it operates as a simple statistical reality, regardless of any coordination or communication within the group. Just being near other individuals reduces your individual predation risk, which creates immediate selective pressure toward group membership even before any more sophisticated social behaviors develop. Here is a widely accepted scientific fact that gives early hominin social structure its full evolutionary context. Primatologists studying the relationship between brain size and social group size across primate species have found a robust correlation. Species with larger social groups tend to have relatively larger neocortices, the brain region associated with complex social cognition. This relationship, formalized in what researchers call the social brain hypothesis, suggests that the cognitive demands of navigating complex social relationships, tracking who is allied with whom, who owes a favor to whom, who can be trusted in which contexts, who is likely to defect under pressure, may have been a primary driver of primate brain expansion generally and human brain expansion specifically. We became smarter, in significant part, because we needed to manage increasingly complex social lives. And we needed increasingly complex social lives, in significant part, because the world we inhabited rewarded social complexity with survival. The specific social structures of early Homo habilis are not directly recoverable from the fossil record. Behavior doesn't preserve in stone, but we can make reasonable inferences from the archaeological record, from comparative primatology, and from the ecological pressures we've been examining. Group sizes were probably variable, expanding and contracting with resource availability and season. Social bonds were maintained through behaviors we can recognize from our closest living relatives: grooming, food sharing, coalition formation, conflict resolution. Communication was more sophisticated than in earlier hominins, though exactly how much more sophisticated and in what specific ways remains genuinely uncertain. Here is the lesser-known fact that reframes early hominin social life in an unexpected direction. Some researchers have proposed that the shift from the grooming-based social bonding of other primates, which requires physical contact and significant time investment, toward language-based social bonding may have been driven partly by the demands of larger group sizes. Grooming works well as a social bonding mechanism in groups of up to perhaps 50 individuals, but it becomes increasingly impractical as group size grows because there are simply not enough hours in the day for every individual to maintain grooming relationships with every other individual. Language, or its precursors, whatever form of vocal and gestural communication early humans were developing, allows social bonding to be maintained across larger groups with less time investment, because you can exchange social information with multiple individuals simultaneously. The campfire conversation, in other words, may be an ancient solution to a very specific social arithmetic problem. Scientists still debate the timeline of language development in the human lineage, and the question of when something deserving the label of language first appeared is one of the most contested in paleoanthropology. The anatomical prerequisites, a descended larynx, specific brain regions associated with language production and comprehension, the fine motor control required for complex vocalization, developed gradually over a long period, and their presence in the fossil record is detectable only indirectly. What is clear is that the direction of travel, even 2 million years ago, was toward increasingly sophisticated social communication. The group settles for the evening in a location chosen with care, elevated enough for visibility, close enough to water for morning access, with the fire established at the most exposed approach. The social negotiations of the day are winding down. Who got more of the carcass this morning? Who responded fastest to the alarm call this afternoon? Who carried the youngest member of the group when the pace had to increase? All of these small social transactions are being quietly processed, stored, and filed against future decisions about trust and cooperation. The group breathes together in the firelight. No single one of them would have made it through today alone. Together, imperfectly and sometimes noisily, they did. Everything we have examined tonight has been building quietly and perhaps inevitably toward a reversal, not a sudden one. Nothing in evolution happens suddenly, and the story of early humans is above all else a story of gradual change, accumulating over spans of time so large that individual lifetimes are essentially invisible within them, but a reversal nonetheless, slow and inexorable, in which the creature that began this evening as regular, expected, accounted for prey, began its long transformation into something the ecosystem had never encountered before and was entirely unprepared to handle. The turning point at which humans shifted from being primarily threatened by their world to being primarily threatening to it is not a single datable moment. It is a process spread across hundreds of thousands of years, visible in the fossil record and the archaeological record as a gradual, then accelerating, rebalancing of an equation that had been running in one direction for a very long time. The earliest signs of this reversal are modest and easy to underestimate. Cut marks on large animal bones at early archaeological sites, appearing in patterns consistent with systematic butchery rather than opportunistic scavenging, suggest that by perhaps 1.5 million years ago, some hominin populations were actively hunting large game with enough regularity to leave a detectable archaeological signature. The specific hominin responsible for these earliest clear hunting signatures is most likely Homo erectus, the species that also pioneered the movement out of Africa and represented a significant expansion of both brain size and behavioral sophistication relative to earlier hominins. Homo erectus was taller, longer-legged, and more energetically efficient in locomotion than its predecessors, a body plan that suggests a lifestyle of covering larger territories, which is consistent with active pursuit hunting of prey animals across open landscapes. The Acheulean tool tradition, associated with Homo erectus and representing a substantial advance over the Oldowan technology we discussed earlier, produced hand axes and cleavers of a sophistication that suggests both improved cognitive planning and more demanding subsistence activities. An Aculean hand axe is not made in a single napping session. It requires a mental template, a sequence of planned removals working toward a predetermined shape, and the patience to execute that sequence correctly over many individual strikes. It is also a more effective butchery tool than anything in the Oldowan repertoire, capable of processing larger carcasses more efficiently and suggesting that the animals being processed were correspondingly larger and more regularly obtained. Here is the widely accepted scientific fact that marks the genuine beginning of the reversal. Zooarchaeological analysis of bone assemblages at sites associated with Homo erectus and later hominin populations shows a progressive shift in the age profiles of hunted animals over time. Early assemblages tend to show the age distribution of scavenged animals, predominantly the very old and the very young. The individuals most likely to die of natural causes or to be taken by other predators. Later assemblages increasingly show prime age adults in the mix, which is the signature of active, selective hunting rather than opportunistic scavenging. Killing prime age adults of large species is not something you do by accident or by taking advantage of convenient natural deaths. It requires planning, coordination, and execution against animals in the peak of their physical capability. It is, in the most direct sense, predation, the weapons that made organized hunting of large game increasingly viable, developed gradually. Wooden spears, which do not preserve well, but have been recovered in exceptional circumstances, most famously the Schöningen spears from Germany, dating to approximately 300,000 years ago, demonstrate that hafted throwing weapons were in use by Middle Pleistocene humans. Projectile technology, the ability to deliver force from a distance, rather than requiring close physical engagement with prey, fundamentally restructured the danger calculus of hunting large animals. A mammoth is an extraordinarily dangerous animal at close quarters. It is considerably less dangerous to a group of hunters with throwing spears positioned at a safe distance, working in coordination to direct the animal's movement and deliver repeated injuries that accumulate toward incapacitation. Here is the lesser-known fact that reframes the entire trajectory of human predation in an uncomfortable direction. The archaeological evidence increasingly suggests that early human hunters were not simply taking individual animals opportunistically, but were in some cases engaging in mass kill events, driving herds of large animals over cliff edges or into boggy ground or narrow defiles, where multiple individuals could be killed simultaneously. Sites in Europe and North America show accumulations of large mammal bones in numbers that are difficult to explain through any mechanism other than coordinated, intentional mass killing. These events represent a scale of predation impact that individual carnivores, regardless of their size or capability, essentially never achieve. A pride of lions takes one animal. A coordinated human hunting group, working a landscape strategically, could take dozens. Scientists still debate the precise contribution of human hunting versus climate change in driving the megafauna extinctions that followed the expansion of human populations across the globe. And the debate is genuinely complex because both factors were operating simultaneously in many cases. What the evidence strongly suggests is that wherever modern humans arrived in significant numbers, megafauna populations declined and in many cases collapsed over timescales that are short in geological terms but long in human ones. The pattern is consistent enough across multiple continents and multiple time periods that human hunting pressure is difficult to exclude as a primary driver. The savanna that we entered at the beginning of tonight's journey, dense with enormous creatures and layered with predator threats, was already beginning its long transformation. Not yet, not quite yet, 2 million years ago. But the process had started. The small, vulnerable, improbably persistent creature huddled around its fire at the edge of the grassland was already carrying, somewhere in its expanding behavioral repertoire and its growing cognitive capacity, the seeds of something that would eventually reshape the entire planet. The predators that owned this landscape tonight had no way of knowing that. They were still running the old calculations. The calculations were about to stop working. There is a particular kind of silence that follows the disappearance of something large. Not the silence of a quiet evening or the comfortable silence of an empty room, but a deeper, more structural silence. The silence of an ecosystem running with pieces missing, processes interrupted, relationships dissolved that had been operating continuously for millions of years. The late Pleistocene megafauna extinctions, which unfolded across the globe between roughly 50,000 and 10,000 years ago, produced exactly that kind of silence. One by one, then in accelerating succession, the great animals of the Pleistocene disappeared. The saber-toothed cats, the giant hyenas, the mammoths and mastodons, the giant ground sloths, the cave lions and cave bears, the short-faced bears, and the giant deer, and the enormous flightless birds, and the terror birds, and the glyptodonts, and the woolly rhinoceroses. Gone. Not all at once, and not without considerable complexity in the specific timing and cause of each disappearance, but gone nonetheless, leaving a world that was quieter, emptier, and considerably less dangerous than anything your ancestors had inhabited for the previous 2 million years. The timing of these extinctions, when mapped against the arrival of modern human populations in different parts of the world, produces a pattern that is difficult to look at neutrally. In Africa, where hominins and megafauna had co-evolved over millions of years, extinctions were more gradual and less complete. African megafauna had time to develop behavioral responses to human hunters and the relationship between humans and large African animals, while ultimately destructive in many cases, played out over a long enough period that some species developed sufficient wariness to persist. In Australia, where modern humans arrived approximately 50 to 65,000 years ago, the megafauna collapse was rapid and comprehensive. Within perhaps 10,000 years of human arrival, the continent's extraordinary array of giant marsupials, enormous reptiles, and massive flightless birds was largely gone. In the Americas, where humans arrived perhaps 15,000 years ago, or somewhat earlier depending on which evidence you accept, a similarly rapid and comprehensive extinction followed, eliminating the mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, American horses, American camels, saber-toothed cats, and short-faced bears within a few thousand years of human contact. Here is the widely accepted scientific fact that frames the extinction debate in its full complexity. The late Pleistocene was also a period of significant climate change, as the last glacial maximum gave way to a warmer interglacial period that restructured habitats across the globe. The question of whether megafauna extinctions were primarily driven by human hunting, primarily driven by climate change, or by some interaction of both factors, has been debated intensively for decades and remains genuinely unresolved for many specific cases. What makes the human hunting hypothesis compelling, despite the climate complication, is precisely the geographic correlation. The extinctions track human arrival across continents with a consistency that climate change alone, which was a global phenomenon, does not readily explain. Continents that humans reached later lost their megafauna later. Islands that humans reached last, or never reached at all in the prehistoric period, retained megafauna longest or indefinitely. The pattern points in a direction that is uncomfortable but honest. Consider what the disappearance of these animals meant for the predator landscape that had shaped human evolution for so long. The saber-toothed cats that had been driving selection for human group vigilance, social coordination, and threat assessment for over 1 million years were gone. The giant hyenas, whose competitive pressure at carcass sites had selected for rapid, efficient tool use and coordinated scavenging behavior, were gone. The enormous raptors that had shaped human tendencies toward overhead vigilance and covered sleeping sites were gone. The crocodilians remained, somewhat reduced in their extreme size expressions. The hippos remained. Various large predators persisted in reduced form, but the density, the diversity, and the sheer intensity of the predator community that had forged your ancestors over millions of years of relentless selection pressure was gone, dissipated into the structural silence of ecosystems running with their largest, most powerful members absent. Here is the lesser-known fact that reframes the extinction story in its most poignant dimension. Some researchers studying the behavioral ecology of surviving megafauna in Africa have noted that African elephants, buffalo, hippopotamuses, and large predators show significantly more wariness and avoidance behavior toward humans than their ecological counterparts on other continents showed when humans first arrived. This difference in baseline wariness is interpreted as evidence of co-evolutionary experience. African megafauna had millions of years to calibrate their responses to human hunters, and the ones that survived were, in a meaningful sense, the descendants of individuals that had been appropriately cautious. The megafauna of Australia and the Americas, encountering human hunters for the first time, had no such calibration. They were, in the language of conservation biology, ecologically naive, unafraid of a predator they had never encountered, in a landscape that had not prepared them for what was coming. Scientists still debate the relative weighting of human versus climate factors in specific regional extinction events, and the conversation is appropriately nuanced given the complexity of the evidence. What is increasingly clear from the accumulating weight of archaeological, paleontological, and ecological research is that modern humans, wherever they arrived in force, fundamentally and rapidly, restructured the ecosystems they entered, not through malice, not through any awareness of the scale of what they were doing, but through the simple application of the hunting capabilities, social coordination, and technological sophistication that 2 million years of being hunted had, with extraordinary irony, selected them to develop. The grasslands that were once thick with enormous shapes moving through the morning mist were becoming quieter. The horizon that once required constant scanning for threats was becoming emptier. The calculations that evolution had spent millions of years installing in your ancestors, the threat assessment, the predator detection, the constant environmental vigilance, were becoming, very slowly, less urgently, necessary. The world that had wanted so badly to eat your ancestors was running out of the things that did the wanting. In their place, something new was inheriting the silence, something that had learned, through the hardest possible school, exactly how the world worked. We have traveled a long way tonight, from the warm, dangerous grasslands of early Pleistocene Eastern Africa, through the layered predator communities that made every movement across that landscape a calculated risk, through the rivers and the skies and the competitive chaos of carcass sites, through the slow accumulation of tools and fire and social complexity that gradually, generation by generation, shifted the terms of your ancestors' participation in a world that had been trying to eat them since before they were recognizably human. We have watched the reversal happen, the hunted becoming the hunters, the prey becoming the predator, and we have stood quietly at the edge of the great silence left behind when the megafauna that shaped 2 million years of human evolution disappeared from the landscape one by one, leaving a world that was, by the standards of everything we have examined tonight, almost eerily calm. That world, the quieter, emptier, megafauna-reduced world that emerged from the late Pleistocene extinctions, is the world your ancestors stepped into as behaviorally modern humans. And here is what is quietly extraordinary about that transition. The nervous system they brought with them into that calmer world was not a nervous system built for calm. It was a nervous system built for the early Pleistocene. It was calibrated for constant threat assessment, for predator detection across multiple sensory channels simultaneously, for rapid social coordination in response to danger, for the particular vigilance required by a creature that had spent millions of years being hunted by things considerably larger and more physically capable than itself. The world had changed. The nervous system had not kept pace, and it still hasn't, entirely, which is perhaps the most personally relevant fact in tonight's entire journey. The startle response that makes you flinch when something moves unexpectedly in your peripheral vision. That is Pleistocene predator detection. Running in a world where the predators are mostly gone, the discomfort of sitting with your back to an open room, the preference for positions that provide visibility of approaches. That is the behavioral legacy of 2 million years of needing to see threats before they reached you. The particular anxiety of darkness, the instinctive comfort of firelight, the social unease of isolation. All of it has deep roots in a world that we can barely imagine from the safety of a modern bedroom, with walls and locks, and a complete absence of anything with saber teeth patrolling the perimeter. Here is the widely accepted scientific fact that brings tonight's journey to its most personal conclusion. Evolutionary psychologists have identified a suite of what they call prepared fears, anxieties, and aversions that humans acquire far more readily than others, and that correspond with unusual precision to the threats that shaped Pleistocene human survival. Fears of snakes, of spiders, of heights, of darkness, of open spaces without cover, of social exclusion. These are not random distributions. They map, with remarkable consistency, onto the actual danger landscape of your ancestors' world. You are not afraid of the things most statistically likely to harm you in the modern world. You are afraid, at a deep and somewhat irrational level, of the things that most reliably harmed humans 2 million years ago. Your fears are an archive of a world you never lived in. Here is the lesser-known fact that closes the circle most gently. Some researchers studying sleep behavior across human cultures have noted that the particular vulnerability of sleep, the enforced unconsciousness, the reduced sensory monitoring, the physical helplessness, may explain the remarkable consistency of certain sleep-related behaviors across human populations regardless of culture. The preference for enclosed sleeping spaces, for sleeping with trusted others nearby, for light sources during nighttime hours, for elevated or defensible sleeping positions. These tendencies appear across diverse human societies and may represent behavioral echoes of the Pleistocene sleeping conditions we examined earlier when choosing where and how to sleep. was a decision with immediate survival consequences. Scientists still debate the degree to which specific modern behavioral tendencies can be cleanly traced to specific ancestral selection pressures, and the field is appropriately cautious about drawing lines that are too straight between ancient challenges and modern psychology. But the broad pattern that human behavior in the present carries meaningful traces of human experience in the deep past is supported by a substantial and growing body of evidence. You are not fully a modern creature. You are a Pleistocene creature in a modern world. And the gap between those two things is the source of much that is both remarkable and occasionally puzzling about human experience. The world that wanted to eat you 2 million years ago made you in ways that are still visible in how you move through the world today. Every social instinct, every environmental vigilance, every preference for warmth and light, and the company of trusted others, these are not incidental features of human experience. They are the inheritance of millions of years of survival in a landscape that was, by any reasonable assessment, trying its best to eliminate you. It did not succeed. Here you are. And now, as the last of tonight's story settles gently into the space around you, it feels right to let the pace slow down a little, to let the imagery soften at the edges, the way firelight does when it burns low and the coals begin to glow in that deep, steady amber that asks nothing of you except to rest. Think for a moment about the enormous distance between that early Pleistocene grassland and where you are right now, the warm, dangerous world of 2 million years ago, the tall grass and the watching eyes within it, the circling shapes overhead, the river with its patient, half-submerged dangers. All of that is so far away now, not just in time, though the distance in time is almost incomprehensible, far away in every practical sense. The walls around you right now would have seemed, to your ancestors, like magic. The absence of predators in the darkness outside your window would have felt, to them, like an impossible gift. The simple fact that you can close your eyes tonight without needing to worry about what moves in the darkness, that is the accumulated inheritance of everything we have explored together this evening. Let your breathing slow a little now. There is nothing requiring your vigilance tonight. The threat assessments can rest. The environmental scanning can go quiet. The ancient, tireless part of your nervous system that has been running its checks since before language existed can be gently informed that the perimeter is secure. The fire is steady, the group is safe, and the long, careful work of another day is done. The grasslands of the early Pleistocene are quiet now. The great animals have gone to wherever great animals go when a world moves on without them. The sky is enormous and still and full of stars that your ancestors also watched from their sleeping places in the ancient dark, perhaps wondering in whatever way they were beginning to wonder about things. What lay beyond the horizon they could see? You are what lay beyond that horizon. You are the answer to 2 million years of questions that survival kept asking. And tonight, in the extraordinary safety of the world they inadvertently built for you through all that stubbornness and flexibility and improbable persistence, you can rest. Let everything go soft now. Let the images from tonight's journey drift and dissolve the way they do when sleep is genuinely close. The saber-toothed cat becoming something gentler. The dangerous riverbank becoming something peaceful. The firelight becoming simply warmth without urgency. The ancient world did its work. You are here. That is enough. That has always been enough.